I'm Janine Castello-Lynn, and on behalf of the Berkeley Historical Society, I'd like to welcome you to our interview today with former City Council member and Mayor Shirley Dean, Mayor of Berkeley and City Council member of Berkeley, that is. And today is Friday, December 3rd, 2021. And because of COVID, both Shirley and I are speaking from our homes. So welcome, Shirley. I think it's best if we start at the beginning, where you were born and how you happened to come to Berkeley.
I was born in Colorado, but actually lived most of my early life in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And when my father died in May of 1945, we moved to California to be with my paternal grandparents, and I've been in Berkeley ever since.
Okay, thank you. So you were born, we should mention that what year you were born, and then how old you were when your father died. You were born in 1935, is that correct?
I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
My son is a techie, and in the computer business says never record when you were born.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry.
That I was 10 in 1945, and that's when I moved with my mother and my sister to Berkeley.
Okay, thank you. So did you come from a political family?
Well, in a way, but at the foot soldier level. My mother was very much supportive of Hubert Humphrey, and she worked on his earlier campaign, which was unsuccessful, to be mayor of the city of Minneapolis. And she also worked on the campaign, which was successful. And we would have these conversations at our house about what she was doing. She was doing precinct work, the kind of door-to-door thing, you know, contacting people and talking with them. And she loved doing that. And we had these conversations. So it was a political family in a way, but it wasn't at a very high level. And it was all centered around the people that we lived around and the people that we knew on the streets of Minneapolis.
Mm-hmm. So who are some of the figures who made an impact on you when you were younger?
Well, actually, my parents, my father, my mother in particular, and her brother, John, who was to me the symbol of heroism, both after my father died and because he sort of became a second father to me. He had landed in the invasion of Europe on Normandy Beach and went with the army all the way to Berlin. And as he went, he wanted to do a connection between where he was and what he was doing and what he was seeing. So he would pick up stamps and he would mail them to me. And I didn't actually know how much or what to do with them, but I was beginning to find out how to be a stamp collector. And then when he got back, he would do father things, like, for example, he taught me how you would map a football game. And he was just the most wonderful person in my life for a while, for a short period of time, because I didn't see him after we left Minnesota.
Mm.
But, definitely the person who had the greatest impact in all times, in all affairs, was my mother.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about how your mother inspired you?
Well, she was a person that she had a good education, but not a college education. She had no particular skills except that of being a homemaker. And when my father died, he had just started a small business, and she was left with with this, which she had to close down because she couldn't run it. And she had to deal with everything that happened. And so she was a single parent to 2 small children, and she had to go out in the world and find a job, and as well as raise us 2 kids. We were homeless for a while, sleeping on the couches of friends until we finally moved to California. And there again, she had to start to find a way that she could support us. And which she did by starting sewing in the infamous sweatshops of the sewing manufacturers, worked her way up to the supervisor, and then eventually she became a tailor in a retail store, and then launched her own business doing alterations.
What were some of the political events which made an impact on you growing up?
Well, clearly, the election of Hubert Humphrey to mayor of Minneapolis. And that was a time of great joy and celebration. Previous to that, he had formed the expansion of the Democratic Party in Minnesota through the combination with the Farm Labor Party. And then he went on to become mayor of Minneapolis. But after that, there was the death of Franklin Roosevelt, FDR. And I was so amazed because I never saw people weeping on the street and embracing strangers and just undergoing the greatest sort of grief, as though their family had died. And then my own father died shortly thereafter, and I felt double grief, if you will. And then there was the victory of World War II. And then again, I was amazed because I would see total strangers hugging people, not in grief, but in joy. Those stand out as events in my life that I don't think could ever be repeated in terms of the impact on the nation and in terms of the impact on individuals.
Yes, and all in one year, 1945.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't exactly 1 year, but
More or less.
very few years.
Yeah. So then you moved to Berkeley shortly after that.
Right.
And you went to Berkeley High, and you
I went to Willard Junior High before then, and
uh-huh,
then Berkeley High School.
and Berkeley High, and then UC Berkeley,
Right.
where you took a degree in social work.
Yes.
And then when you finished, you married a social worker, more or less. He was a school counselor.
Well, he wasn't at the time. He was very interested in youth, and he was working at that time for the California Youth Authority. So when we married, we went up to the Frequel Ranch School, which is a youth authority facility for boys in San Andreas. We lived there for a couple of years, and he then decided that he wanted to get a guidance counselor certificate, which he then went back to school. And we lived for a brief time in Richmond while he got that, and then moved back to Berkeley, I think in the, I don't know, maybe it was the early 60s, 61 or so. And that's when he went to work as a school guidance counselor. And he was active with Berkeley Unified School District in desegregating schools. And at that time, there was great hopes that there could be guidance counselors in every single school in the city of Berkeley, so that kids could begin their education early on and become very successful in completing that education and going on to college. And he loved that work and was with the Berkeley Unified School District at Berkeley High School, at first at Longfellow and then Berkeley High School for years and years and years. And he loved every minute of it.
Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, you were working as a social medical worker
At
at Kaiser. Mm-hmm.
In Oakland.
Yeah. And then eventually you decided you wanted to devote yourself to raising your two sons.
Right.
And then around in the late 1960s, you had
came knocking on our door.
Yes, you want to tell that story? Go ahead.
Very, very heavy German accent. He said that he had purchased the property, the southwest corner of Bonita at Berryman, and he was going to build a great big ugly building, and he was going door to door showing this to everybody, being very proud of it and speaking as though this was going to make this a great neighborhood. We thought it was a great neighborhood the way it was, and we couldn't believe, because it was so out of scale with the rest of the neighborhood, and none of us knew anything about zoning or planning or anything like that. And we were shocked to learn that the city of Berkeley allowed the accumulation of property in a residential area to be able to build bigger and what they called better at that time, bigger and better housing projects. So here he was going to put in, I think it was something like 22 condos or 22 rental units or something of that kind. And we all got together. We were appalled and concerned and decided that we would organize and fight it. And that was the birth of the Bonita Berryman Neighborhood Association.
Okay. And
however, it wasn't the end of the German man. He got his permit and he built his building, and he proceeded to fight rent control and everything under the sun by making the most outlandish statements and proposals. He wanted to call his building a church, and it was a sexually related church. And he did the most bizarre things with the city of Berkeley, requesting them to exempt him from rent control, which he hated.
Well, that sounds like a whole story.
It was.
In terms of where you went from the Bonita Berryman Association, Neighborhood Association, you joined the Planning Commission.
I was appointed to the Planning Commission by the City Council. That was before they made individual appointments. The council would make appointments. So 5 members of the council decided, I can't remember the exact vote, so maybe it was more, but you had to have at least 5, and appointed me to the Planning Commission, probably because I wouldn't keep quiet about what was going on with the, at the corner there, 1910 Berryman Street. And we had absolutely no policies regarding demolition. We had no historic preservation policies or provisions at all. And it turned out that I met this wonderful woman, Rosalind Leposky. She was married to Professor Albert Leposky, and they ran a group called Urban Care. And they were concerned about historic preservation. They were also concerned about waterfront development. And at that time, there were proposals to build first an airport on that waterfront land, the closed dump that was then what was known as Berkeley's front yard. And then later a proposal to put a huge shopping center there. And so I worked with Urban Care And they had a subgroup on historic preservation. And that was the beginning of the adoption of the Landmark Preservation Ordinance, and also of the rejection of the waterfront development as a shopping center, but it would become, in our view and in our vision, a state park. And that's what happened, actually.
Yes. So the process of Urban Cares forming this subcommittee on architectural heritage and urban beautification, I read, to the Landmark Preservation Ordinance in 1974, that was a pretty long process. And you worked alongside someone named Fred Tamke, Tamke, and a lot of people have said some pretty impressive things about him. You want to talk about your memories of him?
Yes, he was a successful advertising executive from San Francisco, and he was dedicated to urban historical preservation. He wanted, first of all, for us to get an ordinance in place, and then after that was in place, to establish a group that would kind of oversee it and push for various structures to become historic structures and to save them in the city of Berkeley. He lived over in the Claremont area, and he was a warm, knowledgeable, and focused individual. He was great in every event. I remember when I moved from the Bonita area to my current home, I was giving a reception for my in-laws who were celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary. And Fred happened to come over and saw that I was running around like a crazy person trying to get everything done. And he quietly stepped in and arranged all the flowers and just kind of did all of the things that a family member might do. So he was a member of everyone's family that was working on historic preservation, and he was such a warm and delightful individual, but he was also so knowledgeable and so focused that he got the job done. Fortunately, he died of a heart attack, and it became our pledge that we would get this ordinance approved. I think he died in 1972, and it became our pledge that we would get this ordinance approved in his honor.
So, yeah, what are some of the strategies you use to get everyone on board?
Well, first of all, we had to convince people in the city that historic preservation was worthwhile. So the first thing we did was we got the Berkeley Gazette, which was then the local newspaper, which you had delivered to your house, and to run a series, an architectural series with fabulous photographs and articles about why this was important for this reason or that reason, and to just get people interested in the subject. That was a resounding success. We then also published a calendar for, I think the first one was around 70. I'm not quite sure that I remember what the date was. I've given the Historic Society some of those old calendars, and again, with beautiful photographs. And that was a financial success. We then, because there was a convention in San Francisco of preservationists, we hooked onto that. We had several Maybeck and Morgan houses that were open for tours. And we ran Greyhound buses full of preservationists. We sold tickets at $15 a ticket, and they were sold out. We ran them through all of North Berkeley, South Berkeley, all over the city. We later found out that preservationists would get hold of the tickets for $15 and sell them to their buddies for $100. But we didn't care because it was such a smashing success and everybody had such a good time, and it worked. We caught the attention of people in the city, and we caught the attention of the city council, and they said, let's have such an ordinance. It was then that we embarked, it was almost 2 years that we embarked on various amendments to the ordinance that was first presented to them as coming from urban care. And it was written by Carl Bunch, who was a labor attorney. And we used to tease him about that. But here he was writing this, but we all worked together and we got these amendments one by one by one, and finally got it passed. Once we got it passed, we then went on to establish Berkeley Architectural Heritage Association, and Leslie Emmington became the first president of that group.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and you wrote that you feel that the Landmark Preservation Ordinance of 1974 is one of the most important ordinances or actions you wrote that came out of that era.
Absolutely. It's been used down through the ages, and it's saved much of what we love in Berkeley today. It established a caring community for not only our history, but the beauty of our history as it's laid out in establishing those structures that should be preserved among all things. There have been some disappointments in more recent years, but the ordinance has stood up and has been positive for the city of Berkeley. And it really represents much of what we all love about our community.
Mm-hmm. So about the same time that the Landmark Preservation Ordinance passed, you decided to run for city council. And
right. I'm not exactly sure why or how, but I did. And I mean, I had no background politically, except for my work on the Planning Commission, which centered around historic preservation and neighborhood traffic. And I ran as an independent because I felt that people in the city of Berkeley were kind of sick of everything that had happened in terms of slates, and they didn't want to just vote a slate ticket. They wanted to pick and choose. So I ran as an independent. My first political fundraiser was held at the Spring Mansion here in North Berkeley, which was in and of itself a remarkable event because the owner had been communicating with the stars, and the building itself had fallen under great disrepair and inside and out. So we cleaned up best we could. We ran a pretty good tour through there. We had some music and people had a good time. And they made some contributions to my campaign. My husband put together you had to run citywide then, it wasn't a district. You had to run citywide, in which we tried to have every block in the city of Berkeley at least showing one sign, elect Shirley Dean to city council. And we were pretty successful in getting that. So I won in 75, although I hadn't really expected I would. I won. It was complete surprise to me, complete surprise. I was not prepared to be a politician. Still, I'm not prepared to be a politician.
Mhm. So what were some of the surprises that met you when you joined the city council in 1975?
The inability of people to debate, even amongst the council, the issues without them becoming personal. I never have understood that. I can't understand how you can avoid putting together the listening to people, because they're the second arm. It's you and the people and nothing else. And listening to people and then putting what they are saying together with what the council members are saying and working out a reasonable compromise. To me, that's how things should be done. And what was happening and is still happening today is the people who show up the most, who speak the loud, shout the loudest, are the people who are being heard. When you have a duty to listen to everyone, you have a duty to consider what needs to be done. And you have a duty to try to get something that will move forward a real problem. And I was surprised to find that to be so very difficult, because the first things I ran into on the council were, one, the firefighter strike in 1975. I think I'd been on the council maybe for a couple of months, and all of a sudden, firefighters were on strike. And it was pretty serious stuff. And because they began blocking trucks coming into the city, and they were beginning to block the garbage trucks that were still dumping out at our waterfront. And the city was in great danger. And all of a sudden, here I am sitting in a hotel room with people I didn't know, the city manager, the city attorney. I was the mayor. Mayor Widener had appointed me and Bill Rumford Jr. to be the negotiating team. I don't know why he picked me. I was as unknowledgeable for this kind of stuff as anybody could be. And we sat there and we worked it out. I think the mayor did much of the hard work, but in any ways, we worked it out. And then along came, after that was settled, along came Prop 13. And all of a sudden we had to make $8 million in cuts in the city budget. And I mean, we looked at everything from reducing hot water in the city hall to reducing, we were thinking about having to lay off 300 workers. And of course, everybody was angry because Prop 13 had passed statewide, but it hadn't in Berkeley. Berkeley had opposed it. So everybody opposed everything that was a cut. But you had to do it because you had to have a deadline. And I remember sitting in my office at my desk looking on, this is at the Civic Center building, and looking at the hallway out through the open door. And a council member, I won't name who it was, came to the door and shouted at me what a terrible person I was for trying to make cuts. And all I could think of at that time was, how could these people think this way when we've been handed a problem and we had to deal with it.
Yeah.
And you know, going out and in terms of, it was like the Vietnam War, we could be against the war, but we didn't have to go out and break all the windows on Shattuck Avenue, or set fire or trash stores or set fire to cars. I never understood that connection.
Mm-hmm. So that's something I'm interested in. Was there a very predominant anti-Vietnam War sentiment in the city council at that time? Was it pretty across the board?
Well, on this in the 60s, yeah.
Yeah, or when you were on the city council, like, which would be the
No,
beginning of the 70s.
It had passed.
It already ended, that's right, in 75.
Well, it hadn't ended. There was still a feeling about the war and the people who had supported the war and how they had to be defeated, et cetera, et cetera. There were various campaigns and issues about who those people were, et cetera. And it always came up, but it wasn't central. Well, maybe it was kind of central because people were defined in a way. I happened to be with the Berkeley Democratic Club, that the April Coalition, which had become then the Berkeley Citizens Action, and the Berkeley Democratic Club had become the ABC, the All Berkeley Coalition, and the two were opposed, and the BDC, ABC members were quote unquote conservatives, Republicans, terrible people who couldn't be trusted, who were going to allow rampant development everywhere, while the BCA, April Coalition, BCA, were people that were more attuned to neighborhoods. And I didn't feel that way at all. But the budget things that came down was that the BCA, the April Coalition BCA folks wanted to support all of the community agencies, all of the nonprofit community agencies that were active in Berkeley, and there were many who were receiving public funds. They wanted to promote, to safeguard those funds and to increase them. And the BDC and the ABC said, sorry, but nothing is protected here. What we have to do is have a budget that provides city services plus the community social services that we need. And it came down to bitter dispute between who was going to get what.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I guess there was a lot of bitterness in the aftermath of the police crackdowns on People's Park, on
Yes.
anti-Vietnam War protests.
And some of it was very correct. Some of it was very correct because there were people, sheriff's department, et cetera, who did do things that were not right. But it wasn't everybody, you know, you had to be more detailed. And instead of this kind of 100%, we're going to say you were wrong. Bitterness really came out in the outstanding 71 election when D'Army Bailey and Ira Simmons and Lonnie Hancock, and I can't remember the student's name, Rudolph somebody, Jeff Rudolph maybe it was, ran, and the Simmons, D'Army Bailey, and Hancock were elected. The student was not. Came onto the council, and D'Army Bailey, and Ira Simmons, who had come to Berkeley. You have to be in Berkeley for 90 days. There's a residency requirement before you can run for office. They just barely made it by a few days. they'd come and they had taken over this, I was told, although I never had the address, a big, beautiful house in the North Berkeley Hills, and were living there. And nobody knew the source of their income because neither one of them were employed. Bailey was a attorney who'd been educated at Yale. Both of them were Black. And Ira Simmons was more a yes person. He was quieter and he just followed D'Army Bailey's lead. And they began on the council by irritating every single other member of the council, including Lonnie. They were, and everybody who came before the council were jumped on and called names, and it went on for a couple of years. And it was very unpleasant. The papers in '71 had hailed this as the first radical takeover of a city government in the nation. So there was lots of national publicity, and it went on from bad to worse until finally in 1973, Wilmot Sweeney, who later became a much admired judge, also a Black man, said, "I've had enough." And he filed recall papers. He publicly called D'Army Bailey a son of a bitch. And that was very unusual for Wilmot Sweeney. He was very moderate in his language. And I have never heard him ever say anything like that before. Incidentally, when they took their seats in 1971, when they first came to be elected, they refused to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Well, of course, that was another national, huge national thing. They wouldn't pledge allegiance to the flag. And they wouldn't do this. And Albany, the city of Albany, decided that they would pledge allegiance to the flag twice, once for Albany and once for Berkeley. And things were going along that way until Ed Colgren said, enough is enough. We won't have the Pledge of Allegiance. We'll do it only once a year. And he took a lot of heat for that, but it calmed that whole situation down in terms of that first encounter. But the other encounters in calling people names and things like that went on for the 2 years until the recall papers. So now they were in recall, and it was a huge fight. It was a bitter fight. It was unbelievable. The slate that BCA put forward said, well, those guys, we don't even talk to those guys anymore, but we don't believe in recalls. Lonnie said, I don't believe in recalls, period. So I'm opposed to the recall. But it was, she never said, I support Bailey or anything like that. And there was a lot of pressure, I think, on her to do so, also pressure not to do so. But she took the road that she just didn't support recalls in general. Anyways, the recall was successful. And then that set off another big old fight in terms of who Simmons remained on the council. Bailey said that he was through with politics. He was going to stick around for a while. Turned out it wasn't very long that he stuck around before he went back east. And he said he was going to deal only with economics and not politics anymore. But it stood out in 1973 as the sort of like the premier political event of the time, both locally and nationally. And it was the beginning when that people were calling it berserkly, at least in my memory. They might have called it that before, but to me, this was when it really took hold. Mm-hmm. And we've been trying to deal with that ever since. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it cemented the the disputes between the two groups.
Mhm. So I guess an erosion of trust. So that was still lingering in the air when you joined the city council in 75.
Right.
But I mean, there are other things to deal with, like the traffic barriers,
Oh, yes, the traffic barriers.
the waterfront development,
Right.
The rent control, the school for the deaf and blind. So there were a lot of different issues. And I guess you were successful in the traffic barriers, the diverters, and eventually you were successful in the waterfront park. I think it was protracted, but you got what you wanted with the Sylvia McLaughlin State East Shore Park.
Right. Now, the thing that I regret about that was that Roz Sapolsky never got the credit she deserved.
Mm.
It was her proposals. It was inviting experts, landscape experts, planning experts, also economic people, everything that you could think of that she brought to people to hear and to convince people that what we needed out there was a glorious park.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for remembering her in your words and today in the interview. And in terms of the blind and deaf school, I think there was a lot of uproar about the university changing its mind on the seismic safety of the building after it acquired the building. But in the end, there was.
In the end, we prevailed. It came to a head one day. I mean, after the people had moved, and they said they had to get away from the seismic problem of the site, and they moved to Fremont. And what happened was they found out it was just as bad there as it was here in Berkeley. And the parents of blind students said, "Hey, you can't go to a place where that's not as urban as Berkeley to teach blind people how to get around an urban landscape." So all of this was happening. Everybody was at everybody's throats. Assemblymember Bates had first put in that the land should go to UC, and then he withdrew that and said, "You guys should figure it out yourselves." And I made the motion that it should go to the Planning Commission, and it should be a plan for both the city and the university to have a role. The city got a housing development there, senior housing development, and the university took over the rest. And they signed agreements with the neighbors. Which those agreements are now coming to an end, and there's still controversy over that. But after that motion, which was approved by the city council, Gus Newport stopped me in the hall. And Gus is a wonderful, warm, affable person. I've always liked Gus as a person, but he was so angry at me for that motion that he said, "You will live to regret this." And he said it through gritted teeth that how furious he was that the city wasn't going to get the whole thing.
Oh, yeah, I guess now things seem like to have worked out pretty well in terms of it. It's not only.
Well, it's not over.
It's not over.
Not over.
Yeah.
There's still concern about what is going to happen there.
Well, I should mention that the elderly housing is also low income.
Yes.
It's low income elderly housing.
Yes.
So that's good. Maybe we should move forward to you ran in 82 against Gus Newport for mayor, and you didn't win. And then in 86 you ran for city council again, and this was the first time that there were district elections instead of citywide elections.
Right.
Um,
Between 82 and 86, we had meetings all over, wondering how we could have a better form of government. And that's when the district elections idea came up, and got it on the ballot, and it was approved, and it was fought. It was fought by Tom Bates, assembly member, by John George. I think he was on the Board of Supervisors then, and Ron Dellums. It was fought by BCA, who thought this was a terrible idea. The students didn't like it, but for some reason we won. And Gus decided not to run for again in 86. And that's when I think Lonnie ran for the first time.
yes. Mhm.
And in any event, the city was experiencing a very difficult time. Our downtown was in shambles, and the council was basically focused around the whole issue of at-large versus district. One of the most bitter parts of that was District 1, in which I think it was Veronica Fuchs and Nancy Skinner wound up in the same district, and they would have to run against each other. Although we hadn't at this point, while there were districts selected, because you had to have a map that where the districts were pretty much equal in terms of population, registered voter population. We hadn't thought about who would be running for what in what districts. And that was not a part of the ballot. The ballot had only to establish the districts. And those were 2-year terms. Later, it would be changed to 4-year terms, and they would run not in April, but in November. There were measures. Measures were put on to get rid of district elections, all of which failed.
So you won in 1986. You
Yeah.
represented, well, you were the first representative from what, District 5? Is that right?
District 5.
District 5. And you were on the city council until 94. Well,
Right.
beyond, in 94, you ran for mayor.
Right.
I guess the question is, what inspired you to run for mayor in 94?
It was the feeling that, again, that we were, that it was more politics than it was problem solving. And I saw what was happening in the downtown area. Things were really bad. It was dirty. People were sleeping on the streets. There was no pride in the community whatsoever. People weren't being helped. They were being ignored. And nothing was happening that I could see that was good. And I had thought about it one time back in 79 when Warren Widener was defeated. And I had won for council. I think I was the only one from the other side that won in that election. And we were all lined up on the city council steps, and we were having the city hall steps, and we were having a May Day celebration of the fact that the city was now in the control of BCA. And I was at the tail end of the long line of people sitting in chairs. And we heard beautiful music, Brandenburg Concerto, as I recall, and some gospel singing, and some Gus made a what I call a forgettable speech, in which he said that if you have to wait long enough to become a radical, then I'm a radical, which I've never quite understood, why he put it that way, but anyway. And then I understood why I was at the end of the row, because the newspapers could crop me out and I could be totally ignored, which was okay. But I sat there and I was thinking, what would it be like to be mayor? That was the first time I'd ever had those thoughts. And I kind of would ask myself at various times later on, what would it be like if I were mayor? And I became more and more interested in that subject as we had changes in the Hinks went out, the department store, the one store downtown that was retail that was operating, and it would go out a little later on. But everything was so dirty and so trashy and so unpleasant. Well, I just thought, well, I could do better.
Okay. Yeah.
And there had been so many things, so many crimes that had occurred that were so disturbing, that put Berkeley on the map. And here was this community that we all loved. And it sounded like it was a terrible place to live. There were the murders, Rainbow Village, and those murders. There was the murder of the Zambrano murder, where the two waterfront commissioners got in a difficult situation, and Enrique Zambrano killed the other one, Luis Reyna, who actually worked in the office that he was an intern in the office that I worked at UC Berkeley. It was terrible. There was the time that the police had to be called into the chancellor's home where he lived on the campus then. And he and his wife were escorted out of the building because the alarm had gone off. But Rosebud DeNovo was hiding in the house and with a hatchet, with the seemingly attempt to assassinate him and his wife, the chancellor and his wife. And she was shot dead by an Oakland police officer. And the city went berserk. I don't know what they thought could have happened. It was just so awful. The kidnapping of baby Carrie out of Alta Bates Hospital by someone who just claimed to be a social worker, walked in and said, oh, I'm going to take the baby to be weighed, and walked out of the hospital and wasn't seen since. Fortunately, they got the baby back. And the terrible incident at the bar in the Durant, in which people were shot and sexually abused. And finally, they were able to get in there and take the person down. Fortunately, I'm kind of stalling in terms of what happened to him, in terms of my memory. But again, these were nationwide publicity things, and coupled with all of the political things going on, and Berkeley just seemed to be in a downward spiral. Mm-hmm. And it needed a voice to come up to bring it out of this spiral. And the person that I was running against, Jelinek, had been very active in the whole issue of, there were to be 79 units or so of public housing built. And he got into, he could not believe that people were concerned about the sites had been selected and everybody was shouting at everybody else. And there seemed to be no way to answer how or where and how these units were to be built. And again, it was the kind of contribution towards civic affairs, which was leading nowhere. And I just felt there had to be a different voice.
So you won in 94.
Right,
And
on a runoff election.
A runoff election, yes. And seems like one of your first priorities was the development of the downtown arts district.
Yes.
And how did that that happened? Partly because the Berkeley rep, which had been in the Elmwood district, lost its lease.
Right, and then they moved downtown, and Widener, when he was mayor, had gotten some grant to assist them, but they were struggling and they were about to walk off again, this time to Oakland. And I said, no, we need you. We need to have an arts district. We need to attract shoppers into our downtown. And it had to be shopping plus an experience. And that experience had to be the arts, entertainment. It could be the movies. It could be live entertainment. It could be concerts. I didn't care which, but it had to be the arts, and it had to be good food plus good shopping. And that's what we set about to do. And they needed $4 million, and we got it through certificates of participation because the city did not have that kind of money. But we passed it over huge objections by Council Member Chris Worthington, who said that it couldn't be done, it shouldn't be done, and instead we did it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it turned out to be a major boost to the downtown. I mean, it definitely. I read somewhere that I think the city put $5 million in, and they estimated in the first, I don't know, year or something that 150 million in revenue was recouped. So it was very successful.
We also got a ton of good recognition, national recognition.
So another thing you were trying to do in terms of making people feel safe downtown was the guides, which I think you were using the resources of the Options Center, which is addiction services in the Veterans Building. Can you tell us a little bit about the guides?
Well, we established them as being people who would be on the street, who would be assisting visitors or residents, didn't matter which, but they would be assisting both in terms of alerting the city to where there were accumulations of trash so we could get it cleaned up, and also where there were problems occurring with behavior on the street. And this worked pretty well because of the amazing work that Dr. Cody did, and also her husband, Tom Gorham, and the work that they did with people in helping people out of the alcoholic and drug addictions. So it worked amazingly well. And we also passed two things. We passed an advisory in terms of, did the citizens want to prohibit, for example, the city attorney said you could prohibit panhandling in terms of time and place. So, for example, we didn't want to have panhandling around ATM machines, things like that. So that was an advisory, but there was also an anti-loitering ordinance on the that same agenda. And that agenda included, you can't loiter around a park or a place of recreation in order to sell drugs and that kind of thing. We got everything passed, but it was very difficult because Councilmember Spring, who had worked with us in trying to put these measures together, who supported them when we were working as a committee to put them together, pulled out at the very last minute. But we did get them passed, and then the issue came down to try to implement them and to try to implement them in a way that would be supportive for the people who needed help, but enforceable for the people who wanted to come and enjoy the downtown and to eat out, to have a pleasant time in the city of Berkeley, and to support the city. So we were trying for a balance. And I think that we achieved that balance. In the beginning, it did later on unwind. When I was defeated in 2002, the first thing that went were the guides. The guides that had been on, they were cut from the budget, and they were later established, but under a kind of different program called ambassadors, and it wasn't quite the same thing.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we're getting close to the end of our interview, and so I'll just mention some of the many accomplishments during your mayoral tenure. The I-80 bridge connecting Berkeley to the East Shore Park.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
You know, that was so wonderful the day we got that open.
Yeah, so you can use, so bicycles, for example, can,
bicycles and strollers and people just walking. And I'm so sorry we lost that piece of art. I think we should have, if we can't get that one back, we should have another piece of art there, because we should celebrate the arts in all ways. But it allowed a way for people to get to the park without having to drive up University Avenue.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, and then the Marin Circle fountain was refurbished under your watch?
Yes, and that was a day, every time I go by that fountain, I have to smile. I call it the Fountain of Smiles. It was a simple matter, really, of putting together people from all walks of life who now created the largest privately financed public works department or public works project in the city's history. Mm. And it continues to this day to be well financed privately with volunteers working cooperatively with the city. And it is a place of great love by everyone. That day in which I was able to ride to it on an old fire engine, which is a wonderful experience, but just simply the pouring of the waters into the fountain that started the water flowing, and then flowing flipping the switch to make the waters flow was wonderful. The last part of putting the waters in. I mean, Sylvia McLaughlin put in some waters from the bay, and there was waters from Marin Creek by a student from the high school. And there was a water that was put in from the fountain that is on UC campus property that was also designed by John Galen Howard. And then the last one, Sarita Waite, who had restored the so-called bears, and some people say look a little bit like rats, but they're really bears, where she poured a bottle of good quality champagne into the water, and then we flipped the switch, and the waters have flowed ever since.
Yes, and now they have wreaths on them, I think, because it's Christmas time. Absolutely. So, yeah. Quickly, the Pyramid Brewery, which was, I think, the first brewery in that area in 10th yes. and Gilman, and now there are many breweries and wine tasting places in that area.
And they're successfully operating.
Yes. You worked hard on gun control
Yes.
And there's a monument to gun control at the west entrance to the Civic Center building that's
Right,
made from melted down guns.
it is walled off. Unfortunately, it ought to be in some place where people can understand that it was made from melted down guns.
Mm-hmm.
And we had always promised that the names of the people who had paid for all of this to happen would be mounted somewhere near it. That didn't happen after, because I was not elected, and it just kind of disappeared. But it was our statement, our commitment for gun control, that we wanted that to be recognized. And now nobody seems to understand anything about that piece of art.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's a tragedy.
Well, on an up note, the Gaia building was one of the first new multi-use buildings in downtown Berkeley. And it has many apartments above and below.
And 19 low income, 19 low income units in there.
And 19 low income units, yes. And that's on Alston, I believe.
Yes.
And that's where the Brower Center is. So I'm going to, there are other things you worked on, many other things, but I think it's time to close now with some reflections from you on what you learned, I guess, as a person, and also what you learned about what makes government work from your time in city government.
Well, I learned an awful lot, and I'm still learning a lot. But one of the things that most concerns me at this point is the fact that we no longer have civil discourse. We do not seem to be able to meet and hear and discuss the things that need to be done in a usual tone of voice without making it personal. People seem to go into local government as though it's a career, and it shouldn't be a career. This is government by the people, for the people, and it shouldn't be, handled by professional, quote unquote, professional politicians. It should be, people seem to be looking like, what's my next step? What do I have to do to keep favor with whomever is important? That shouldn't be. It should be focused on what needs to be done and how it's going to be done, why it should be done, and getting it done. And it doesn't seem to be happening. I was so surprised when, for example, the city of Berkeley decided to pay its city council members like it was a job. And I'm concerned about that, because it isn't a job in a way. It's not a paid job. It's not something that you do because you want the money. It's something that you should be doing because you want to make a difference. And so you can't be looking at what the next step will be all the time. Otherwise, it gets pretty, it's mechanical, or it's on the wrong track. We have now a state government that thinks that it can support, or it can do all of the local land use planning for every little city in the state of California, from tiny Angels Camp to sprawling Los Angeles, and use the same kind of mechanisms in both. And it does not recognize the uniqueness of cities, their geological uniqueness. For example, Berkeley has a wildfire interface. It has a earthquake zone. It has a sea level problem. It has all of these things that Sacramento doesn't have, but yet we're treated the same and will have the same obligations. So we're not making headway in terms of how we address housing, for example, which has always been a major problem. And we need to address housing, but not just housing. We need to address affordable housing. And we need to not have the mandates come from Sacramento, from the state government or the federal government. I remember when you had local control over land use, and you also had local control over your school district. I read an article this morning's papers about how school districts have no control whatsoever. So how do we speak to the uniqueness of the people that we want to serve and to make their lives better? So we need to get away from this one size fits all mandate coming out of Sacramento. Yes, we have obligations to climate change. We have obligations to people who need help. We have obligations for the education of those people. We need to see that they get done. We have obligations for adequate open space, but we also have to pay attention to things like sea level rise, earthquakes, wildfires, all of the things that we know now are things that are disturbing to our futures.
Yes, well, yes, thank you. I think those remarks reflect how times have changed since the 70s, 80s, and even 90s in terms of what our priorities are. They used to seem political, and now I think they seem more ecological. The politics have to deal with the ecological. So yes, well, thank you very much, Shirley Dean, for your reflections. We thank you also for your written answers, and they will all be available on the Berkeley Historical Society website. So
thank you for doing this. I think it behooves all of us to go back and to look at what has happened and to try to come together to forge a much, much brighter future for this city.
Yes. Well, thank you to you for your contributions to the city.